Okay, recording now. Hello and welcome to lecture one from business development. And this will be an introduction to business development, and we'll be looking at the business and its environment. And you're joined by myself, Eilish, and Nuala is here as well.
Hi, how are you doing? Looking forward to working with you on this module.
Okay, so just an overview of what we'll be looking at. So we'll be getting started on business development. We'll talk through the 7 units and what the learning outcomes are for this module. And then we will look at the macro and micro environment, and we'll look at SWOT and PESTEL analysis as tools for analyzing the environment. We'll talk about environmental scanning, and we'll outline a few strategies that businesses might use if they notice changes in their environment.
And just to say that this module is accompanied by a manual, which will be available to you as well. And the manual actually deals with all of those issues that Eilish set out.
Yeah, and in that manual, we have 7 units. So the first unit is management theory, and that goes through, I suppose, the evolution of management thought over time, right up to contemporary management. Unit 2 then looks at business and its environment, and that's the macro and micro environment, which we will be looking at today in more detail. Unit 3 looks at enterprise development. Unit 4 looks at developing opportunities. Unit 5 looks at managing growth. Unit 6 looks at human resource management, and Unit 7 looks at market positioning.
And while the units deal with business and enterprise very much, they also deal with like social enterprise. So we'll be looking at this in the context, maybe I think it can be quite useful for community enterprise or social enterprise as well as traditional businesses.
So before we get going, just to say what the learning outcomes from this module are. So when you have completed the module, you should be able to demonstrate an understanding of the requirements for development of a business opportunity. You should be able to demonstrate the skills to identify and manage business opportunities, to determine the key functions of a management role, to develop and implement business opportunities, to produce a growth strategy for the business, enterprise, or community organization, to summarize a model of corporate social responsibility, and to implement an effective policy on ethics in organization. So they're the basic learning outcomes from this module. And as you can see, it's really looking at how to develop business opportunities and then how to manage the business itself. So looking at things like growth and managing change. And then there's an ethical area where we're looking at corporate social responsibility and ethics. Okay, so diving in, we're going to look in this lecture at Unit 2, Business and its Environment. So when we talk about business and its environment, sometimes people get confused and they think we're looking at the environment as in, climate change, etc. But when we talk about the business environment, we're talking about the internal and external environment in the business. So everything that's going on inside the business and everything that's going on outside the business and how that affects the business. So when we talk about the external environment, we're talking about the macro environment. That's everything that's happening outside of the business, but it does impact and affect the business. So here we have demographic forces, economic forces, natural forces, technological forces, political forces, and cultural forces. So some examples of that, I suppose, if we're talking about demographic forces, what we're talking about there really is the structure of society or the population um, around the company. So these can be things like age, gender, educational background, economic background of, I suppose, the people, your customers. Economic forces then can look at things like taxes. It can look at, I suppose, how much money is in the economy, how much people are spending, how much people are saving, how much support there is for businesses, economic supports there, and the global economy as well in terms of trade. Um, and I suppose global economic forces are becoming more and more important now with kind of online sales and this kind of rise in globalization. We then have natural forces, and here we're talking about things like the weather, which can have an impact on your business if there's flooding, if there's, if it's seasonal, different kind of natural forces that can impact on the business.
And would COVID be something that would go into the natural forces, although of course it would have economic and political impacts as well? But
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, that's a great point, and I suppose something that's so current and has such a strong impact on businesses at the moment and is a natural force. Yeah.
And these are things that, as we said, that when we look at this macro environment, as Alice was saying, we're looking at it, that what's out there in the world and how it actually impacts on your own business and on business in general.
Yeah, technological forces then, I guess we're looking at things like, new technology and how that can impact a business, or sometimes, make a business redundant if some kind of technology comes in that kind of replaces the need for that business, or it can improve business or make business more efficient in some way. But again, technology is changing so rapidly, so it's something that businesses need to watch and keep an eye out for how that's impacting on your business. Political forces then, I suppose we're talking about things like, conflict and things like that are kind of larger things that can impact business, but also, policies that are in place to support businesses or to tax businesses, etc. They can all be political forces.
And I'm imagining the one that comes up all the time now is Brexit and how that's going to impact. So sure. That political decision, again, it's going to have economic impacts and so on, but a political decision around Brexit or the EU or those kind of political decisions that are made, that how they impact on business.
Yeah, and finally then we were looking at cultural forces. This one can be a little harder to analyze than some of the other forces, but I suppose how culture changes over time. So we could be looking at things like the role of women. We could be looking at things like the rise in vegetarianism. We're talking about kind of taste and interests and different kind of cultural forces in that way. So if there's a large migrant population, maybe that needs to be taken into consideration, or religious viewpoints, etc. So yeah, cultural forces can be a little harder to analyze, but they also are important and do impact on a business.
And you can kind of see if you go shopping, areas for different types of foods that from different backgrounds, different European backgrounds, for example. So I think that the shops are trying to, or the retailers are trying to sort of make sure that their stock is representative of many different tastes. And I think that's probably a cultural factor. Or you can see the big organizations that Aldi, etc., they might have an Italian area, a Greek area, etc., which is representative of the different, I suppose, cultural factors that are in play at the moment.
Yeah, And so when we're looking at the macro environment, as I mentioned before, it's the major external factors, and these factors tend to be uncontrollable. So you as a business, you can't necessarily control the culture that surrounds you, or political decisions that are made. However, it does influence on your decision making and affect your performance and strategies. So while you can't control them, you are impacted by them, and you do have to respond to those forces. And those forces will affect it's the microenvironment or the internal environment that we'll talk about in a moment. So a nice example here of a macro environment influence would be changes in interest rate, changes in cultural tastes, disastrous weather, or government regulations. So there are a few of the kind of external macro environmental influences that you cannot control, but you do need to be aware of and you do need to respond to. Okay, so one tool that we use to analyze the macro environment is a pestle analysis. And this is where you look at the impact of each of these forces on your business. So political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal.
And again, it's just a tool for sort of analyzing that micro environment. And I will be using that tool, I think, throughout the module.
Okay, so moving on then to the micro environment, and here we're talking about internal environment, what's going on inside your company, and these are things that you are able to control and change, and they're things that you need to be very aware of as well. So here we have customers, employees, competitors, media, shareholders, and suppliers. So there's some of the things that occur in the microenvironment. And you might have noticed that the competitors come into both the macro and the micro environment. They're in the macro environment because you can't really control what your competitors do. They're in the micro environment because you can differentiate yourself from competitors, which means you can kind of control who your competitors are. So that one does pop up in both micro and macro. However, usually they're, you know, all the other factors are in one or the other. So just to define the microenvironment, the microenvironment of the organization consists of those elements which are controllable by the management. So normally the microenvironment does not affect all the companies in an industry in the same way because the size, capacity, capability, and strategies are different. So that's a key piece of information. Macro environment tends to impact all companies in the same way. For example, the price of electricity goes up or the price of electricity goes down. That would impact on all organizations in the same way. Whereas with the micro environment, you know, there can be, the elements can impact organizations in very different ways. So a nice example there is a raw material supplier might give more concessions to a large size company, and they may not give those same concessions to small companies.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So these are the kind of distinguishing factors between the micro and the macro, really, in terms of how you can control or how you can respond to them, and what you have control over on a daily basis, and what you know, decisions that you can make on a daily basis, and larger factors that are impacting on your competitors as well.
Okay, so another very helpful tool of analysis is the SWOT analysis, and that looks at the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats of your organization. And this looks at both internal and external factors, so it can analyze both the micro and the macro environment. And looking at it here from a micro environmental perspective, you'd be looking at kind of internal factors, but you can use it also to look at external factors, especially within the kind of opportunities and threats. So you'd be looking at the strengths and weaknesses, which would be kind of more internal microenvironmental factors, and then the opportunities and threats, which can be both internal and external, so micro and macro environmental factors.
And I think sometimes, Ash, can we think of those the strengths and weaknesses as been now, the here and now, what's happening at the moment,
Yeah.
and the opportunities and threats kind of look into the future. Yeah, so if you're looking at that, so that's another way to sort of think about it when you're looking at a SWOT in relation to your microenvironment.
And again, this is an important tool, and it will be mentioned throughout the manual in different sections. You'll see the PESTEL and the SWOT analysis coming up again and again, because they can be used for different, I suppose, times when your organization needs to make decisions. So both SWOT and PESTEL can really help an organization analyze what's going on, what they want to do, and what's their best strategy moving forward. Okay, so now we've talked about what the micro and the macro environment is, and we've looked at some tools that help to analyze those in micro and the macro environment, see what's going on. So once you kind of are aware of what's going on with in your organization, then you kind of have to develop strategies and ideas in order to, I suppose, make the most of opportunities, you know, make the least of threats, make the most of your strengths, and trying to kind of get over those weaknesses. So first thing you need to be doing is this environmental scanning, and really what that means is doing your analysis, so carrying out micro and macro analysis. And because I suppose the environment is ever changing and it's very dynamic, especially now with globalization, we're talking about, you know, there's so many influences on business. So businesses should carry out environmental scanning. And there's kind of three ways that businesses carry out environmental scanning. First way is ad hoc scanning. This is kind of short-term, infrequent examinations and usually initiated by a crisis. So there's a problem you need to change, you carry out an environmental analysis at that point. Regular scanning is then scanning that's done on a regular schedule. So maybe a couple of times a year, businesses might say, we always carry out an environmental scan or an environmental analysis, you know, twice a year to see what's going on, and then to adjust our strategy accordingly. And the third way then is continuous scanning. And this is where you're continually collecting data and processing this data on a broad range of environmental factors. So it's on a continuous daily monitoring evaluation all the time, keeping an eye on what's going on in the environment. And I suppose the continuous scanning is the one that is most recommended now by theorists. If you have the resource within your business to kind of implement and carry out continuous scanning, it can kind of avoid a lot of issues that may arise.
And also, I suppose, gives you the evidence that you need in order to make decisions, and also how to make decisions internally and externally, or how to approach others or agencies around decisions if you've got the data collected.
Yeah. Okay, finally, now we're going to look at 6 strategies for business. Okay, so, you know, you've noticed that there's some issues going on in the kind of environment, and you need to develop strategies to deal with these issues, whatever they might be. So the first strategy some businesses will take is an opposition strategy. And this occurs when the firm tries to influence the environmental forces so as to negate their impact. So this is where, rather than changing your strategy, you change the environment in some way. So this will only be successful if you have some control over the environmental variable, and can be quite difficult to undertake. So if it's a macro environmental factor, then, you know, opposition strategy would not work.
And Eilish, could you say, I was just thinking again in terms of the COVID, You know how there's this huge debate around, like, should we shut, shouldn't we shut? They are coming in that sort of opposition. Maybe that is coming into that opposition strategy. I'm not sure, but it just, that whole debate around, like, should we close our businesses, or should business be closed? Should it be open? Can we stop the tide? Do you know what I mean? For this major macroeconomic issue that's happening,
Yeah, so we can, I suppose, so if you try to bring in, if as a business, if you try to oppose or have an opposition strategy at the moment, in terms of COVID, I guess it wouldn't work, because you can't control the government policy and you can't control the natural force of COVID itself. So you would probably fail as a business if you said, I'm going to, try to change that in some way, rather than the second strategy then, which is adaptation strategy. So this occurs when a firm adapts their marketing plan to the new environmental conditions. Okay, so you see there's a new environmental condition in some way, and then you plan and you adapt to it. The third strategy then would be offensive strategy, and this occurs when the firm tries to turn the new influence into an advantage. So a quick response can often give the firm a competitive advantage. So that's a key element. We see this often, particularly when things like, we'll say, the media comes into play. If you can kind of take on board something that's happening in the environment and turn it to your advantage. So maybe it's a threat, or maybe it's a weakness, or maybe it's some kind of opportunity. And if you can respond quickly to that environmental factor, then you can turn it into a competitive advantage. And this would be an offensive strategy.
Yep.
Okay, then there's redeployment strategy. So this occurs when the firm decides to divert its assets into another industry. So, perhaps because of this environmental change, you need to change course and divert your energy and assets into another industry. The fifth one then, contingency strategy. So this is when you say, there isn't one best plan, and you determine a broad range of possibilities. So a broad range of possible reactions, finding different substitutes for your business strategy. So you might try out a few different strategies if you go along the contingency strategy path. And the final one, which you might not consider a strategy, but is a business strategy itself, is a passive strategy. So this occurs when the firm does not respond to the issues detected. It may not recognize the force affecting its future prospects, and it continues as normal. So that's also a strategy that you can take. You could just continue as normal and do nothing. And that could threaten the business, depending on, I suppose, what's going on and what you've detected within the environment. Okay, so that's the 6 strategies for businesses who detect some issue in their environment and maybe decide to make some kind of a change.
And what we need to think about, I think, in relation to all of these strategies and the issues that we've discussed, is that this is simply just a presentation of maybe the theory around that. And what we need to look at is how that works in real life examples in places that in your own work or in your own organization, to try to apply those strategies or big picture issues into kind of reality, I think.
Yeah, and as we go through the business development module, you will be able to kind of apply these to real life cases, and that will kind of give you a grounding, I suppose, in understanding how it all plays out in real life. Okay, so that comes to the end of our online lecture 1, business development, and we looked at getting started on the business development and the learning outcomes, the macro and the micro environment, and looking at a SWOT and pestle analysis. We looked at environmental scanning, and we looked at some of the strategies that businesses might use. So thanks for listening, and we will talk to you soon. I'm trying to stop the recording there.